So, hello everybody. I think as you can hear, I'm more or less fine. Oh, there's a couple people to admit. One second. Okay, so admit all. Okay. I think you can hear that I'm more or less fine. I appreciate everybody's good wishes and so on and so forth. Yeah, COVID is no fun, but it is, at least I didn't have a very serious case apparently, so here I am. It is unpleasant, but it's not the end of the world as far as I'm concerned. We will see how we manage to progress tonight. I may start coughing, I don't know. That's been the main problem for me. But let's just go for it, and whatever will be, will be. If I can't continue, I'll let you know for whatever reason. Okay. So we said that we were going to look at a piece of Zohar from now and until we change the format. But I think Zohar is always a very interesting approach to things, always a very different approach. And it can be extremely enlightening and highlights ways of looking at things which I think are not only unusual, but turn out to be very, very useful. So what we're going to do is just a section of the Parsha, a section of the Torah reading for this week. Every week there's a different section of the Torah that's read. This week is the section called Lech Lecha, the section where Abraham is first told by God to go to the land of Israel, and he's promised the land of Israel, and so on. Now, right in the beginning, we're talking about here chapter 12. Chapter 12, it starts in about verse 7, where God tells Abraham that he will give the land of Israel to his descendants after him, and then he tells him to go to the land of Israel. Abraham goes to the land, and very shortly after he arrives, there's a famine in the land, and he is forced to travel to Egypt to find food. So, of course, he takes his wife Sarah with him, and his nephew Lot, the son of his brother, and they go to Egypt on a temporary basis, of course, but as they're coming towards Egypt, Abraham starts thinking, and he says to Sarah, you know that the Egyptians are people who are, how shall I say it, they're soaked in improper sexual behavior. And as soon as they find out that you're my wife, since you're a beautiful woman, they will kill me and take you to Pharaoh as a wife. Let me just read you some of the verses over here. As they were about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, who at this time her name was actually Sarai, not Sarah. Her name was changed later on. But Abraham says to Sarai, his wife, see now, I know that you're a woman of beautiful appearance. And it shall occur when the Egyptians will see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but you they will let live. Please say that you are my sister. Tell the Egyptians that you are my sister, that it may go well with me for your sake, and that I may live on account of you. And that's exactly, in fact, what happened. As soon as they got into Egypt, they took Sarah to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh was struck with various plagues and could not consume the act which he very much wanted to consume. In other words, have relations with Sarah. And he couldn't do it, and he suddenly realized that there must be something behind this, there must be something going on. And in the end, he discovers that Sarah is actually married to Abraham, and he gives them gifts and then sends them on their way. So the usual question is, this is a very sort of unusual behavior of Abraham's to put his wife in such a situation that she might in fact be violated by Pharaoh. Now, there are explanations of this that prior to the time of the giving of the Torah, there was no such thing as actual divorce per se. In other words, the Torah sanctioned concept of get. A get is a divorce, an official divorce. If a woman has relations with someone who is not her husband and she doesn't have an official get, according to Torah law, any child that they have would be a mamzer, would be a bastard. And it is a very, very serious, one of the very serious crimes. Sorry, that's my phone. Just let me turn it off. Let me just turn it off altogether because he's going to call again. Okay. So it's a very, very serious crime, the crime of adultery. And this is something that obviously Abraham and Sarah would not want to be involved in. However, there are opinions and explanations of how it wouldn't technically have been a case of adultery, because prior to the Torah, the divorce was simply a mutually consensual agreement to separate from one another. And the way it was done was that Sarah was in fact no longer, so to speak, married to Abraham. But let's not get into all the fine technical details of why it would have been sort of okay. How could Abraham have done such a thing is the question that we ask. And it's a question, in fact, that the Zohar itself asks. How could Abraham, who was this saintly person, completely devoted and dedicated to God, how could he possibly have even thought to have his wife put in danger of being violated by Pharaoh? Now, one of the answers that's given is Abraham was absolutely sure, because he had seen that Sarah was protected completely by a guardian angel, and he understood that nothing would ever happen to her. Even if she would go into Pharaoh's palace, nothing would happen to her. Besides the fact that relying on a miracle like this is not exactly according to Torah law, we do not put ourselves in danger on the expectation of being saved miraculously. Besides that, it still begs the question, how could Abraham even consider such a situation, relying on Sarah's titkus, her righteousness, to save her? He's still putting her in a situation which is very compromised situation. So in order to be able to explain this, the Zohar analyzes the situation a little bit differently. What do Abraham and Sarah represent? Says the Zohar, Abraham represents the soul and Sarah represents the body. The husband and wife situation of Sarah and Abraham is the normal situation of the soul and the body. In other words, in any mystical tradition, and in Jewish mystical tradition as well, the primacy is given to the soul, and the soul subdues, so to speak, or controls, rules over, subdues the body in order to be able to get to the ultimate mystical truths which are revealed within the soul. The Zohar turns over this general paradigm and explains to us, I'll get to some questions later, Ellen, if that's okay. The Zohar turns this paradigm on its head and explains to us that Abraham says to her, if we look at the actual verses, he says to her, please say that you are my sister, that it may go well with me for your sake. In other words, tell them that you are my sister rather than my wife, and that will be of benefit to me, to the soul. That will be of benefit to the soul. Now, how exactly does this work? What is the Zohar trying to explain to us over here? The normal way of understanding things, as I mentioned already, is that the soul has primacy and the soul controls the body. Says the Zohar, that is not necessarily the case. In fact, the relationship of husband to wife, and traditionally in Torah, the relationship of husband to wife is the relationship, not in Torah traditionally, I meant in Kabbalah traditionally. Traditionally, the husband is represented by the sfirot called Zer Anpin. Zer Anpin is the sfirot of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod in a cluster, and Yesod. Again, from Chesed to Yesod in a single cluster called Zer Anpin. The smaller countenance, I'll explain what that means in a second. And the wife is represented by Malchut. Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor, is the Sfira of Malchut. So the relationship between the Sfirot, the higher Sfirot, the Sfirot of Zer Anpin and Malchut, is that the flow of energy generally is from the higher Sfirot to the lower Sfirot, from Zer Anpin to Malchut. I should really have gotten a diagram ready, and I didn't because I was doing other things. So just one second. Let me just get the here we go. This is the right one. Sorry about this. No, it's not the right one. Sorry. All right. I will just go with this one, and that's all. It's not perfect. It'll have to do. But yeah, let me share screen. And it's not the usual diagram, as you can see. It's definitely not not ideal, but okay, here we go. Keter, Chochma, Bina, etc., etc. These are the Sfirot of Zer Anpin, from Chesed through Yesod, from Chesed through Yesod, and that would be Malchut, right? That would be Malchut. So the usual flow of the Sfirot is from the highest Sfirot to the lowest Sfirah within a particular world. Each of the worlds has the same internal structure, the same 10 Sfirot represent that same inner structure. So in other words, starting with Keta and ending with Malchut. And each world has the same structure, but within the world, the flow of spirit, the flow of divine energy is from Keta to Chochma, from Chochma to Bina, then to Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and finally to Malchut, which is the final manifestation of the divine energy, called Malchut, or the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is the manifestation of the divine energy. Now, the usual path of things and the usual manner of flow is, as we said, from above to below. However, in this particular case, when Abraham says, do not say that you are my wife, because again, the relationship of husband to wife would be the relationship of Zer Anpin to Malchut. Says the Zohar, when Abraham said to her, tell them you are my sister, he was saying, let's look at it from a different point of view. Let's look at it from the point of view of a brother and sister. A brother and sister relationship is obviously going to be a very different relationship from the relationship of a husband to a wife. A husband to a wife is a flow from above to below. Now, we're not talking in negative terms over here. That's just that's the structure of the flow. But when we're talking about a brother and sister are equal. They both come from the same parents, and they are regarded as just being the male and female equivalent. Male and female equivalent. So Abraham is saying, therefore, don't let us present ourselves to Pharaoh not as the soul and the body, but let's represent ourselves to Pharaoh as being equal partners. Equal. So that you are my sister, you're not my wife. We're going to look at the relationship as an equal relationship where the body and the soul are equal. And then once the goal has been achieved of equalizing the two of us, then the forces of the forces of evil, the forces of negativity in the world will do good things for me because of you. In other words, what he's saying to Sarah is that the soul will benefit from the body. Usually we understand that it's the body that benefits from the soul. The soul is the divine energy, the divine light that infuses the body. And when the body submits willingly and even eagerly, in the case of a mystic, to the dictates of the soul, then the person arises to achieve a sort of soul level in his own consciousness. That's the normal way of things. Says Abraham over here, let's invert for this particular purpose, let's invert this whole relationship. What is there in the body that can give the soul what the soul does not have? And the answer is that the manifestation of godliness in the world is something that the soul itself does not experience directly. Since the soul transcends the mundane world, therefore the soul is lacking to a certain extent let's call it the experience of the world, the experience of godliness in the world that can be experienced by the body, that is experienced by the body given the right circumstances. So says Abraham to Sarah, let's invert the usual picture. Let's invert the usual structure of things. Let it be that the body is regarded as being equal to the soul in terms of the ability to enlighten the person. The physicality of the world, the physicality of the body, when it is used in the proper way, when it is used as a vessel for godliness, is equally important as the soul. Let's give two examples of great prophets who represented these two aspects: Moses and Elijah. Moses, when he was born, it says that the house was filled with light. When Moses was born, the place was filled with light because his soul immediately manifested the light, the divine light within his body. His body, in other words, was not a barrier to the light of the soul, and therefore he manifested godliness all the way down, even into the physical world. And the house was filled with light. Anyone who saw him saw that the place was filled already with light. It's explained that Moses was, there are different explanations and different sections in the Zohar that discuss this. One of the most common explanations is that Moses was on the level of Tiferet. He was on the level of Tiferet. In other words, the very center, let me share screen again, the very center of the very center here, Tiferet, the very center of the structure of these six sefirot, the very center thereof. Whereas Elijah, Eliyahu, was the sefirah of Malchut. Now, when Elijah passed away, so it says that his body ascended up on high. His very body ascended to heaven. Moses was not like that. Moses' body was buried. Where it was buried, we don't know. It wasn't buried by a human being. Could be that he buried himself, or according to the Kabbalistic works, he was, so to speak, buried by God. But in other words, his body did not join his soul in the ascent, which is not true of the prophet Elijah. Elijah ascended to heaven with his body. In a more technical sense, these are called two different types of souls. One soul is called the soul of Ma. That's the soul of Moses, is the soul of Ma. I'll explain this in a minute. And Elijah is the soul of Ban. The soul of Ban. B-A-N. Now, what does this mean? The divine name, which is always spelled Yud He Vav He, when the spelling is iterated, when it's fully spelled out, so it can be spelled in different ways. One way of spelling it is Yud is always Yud Vav Daled. Then the first He of the name can be spelled with an Aleph. It could be spelled with a Yud, or it could be spelled with a He. If you spell it with an Aleph, and then the Vav is again Vav Aleph Vav, and the final He is He Aleph, then the gematria, the numerical value of all the letters together, is 45. 45. And 45 in gematria, let me just show you on the screen, a whiteboard, 1 second. So it will go like this, right? We have the letter He, Yud, Vav Daled. I'll do it not in cursive because it's easier that way for you to see. That's a Yud, and then a He will be a He and an Aleph, right? A He Aleph. And then Vav is Vav Aleph. This writing with a Vav Aleph Vav. I'm in the middle of giving a class. Vav Aleph Vav, and then the final He again, the same thing over here. Same thing. Okay, so if you add that all up, that comes to 45. Okay? Now, if you spell it slightly differently, if the He is spelled He, like that, 2 He's, and the Vav is just spelled Vav, Vav, and then the final He is again He, all right, that is equal to 52. 52. Now, 45 is called Ma, the name Ma. 45, and that's called the name Ban. Right, the name Ban. Some say Ben, but in order not to confuse us, let's call it the name Ban. Okay, so what is the difference between these two names? So the difference is in how they approach their function in the world, what it is, what their mission is in the world. Souls of Ma are not really part of this world, and their function and their duty and their mission is to bring light down into the world, just as Moses brought light down into the world when he was born. And that's in fact what he did his entire life, was to bring godliness into the world, to bring the Torah down to the world, etc., to bring what is up above, what transcends the world, into the world. Whereas Elijah and those souls that are associated with the name Ban, their thing is to bring the world up to a holier place, not to bring godliness down into the world, but bring the world up into a higher level of godliness, a higher way of doing things. And this is exactly what happened with Abraham and Sarah. Abraham's idea was initially to bring godliness down into the world. But because they were going down to Egypt, Abraham didn't just want to survive going down to Egypt. He didn't just want to remain unharmed and untouched. He wanted to be able to extract something out of Egypt that would not normally have been within his grasp. How could he do that? Only through the good graces of Sarah, not the good graces, but through the avodah, through the hard work of what Sarah represented. Sarah was also nervous about going to Pharaoh. Don't make any mistake about it. It wasn't just everything will be fine. No, she too was no doubt a little bit nervous about going to Pharaoh, but she understood just as well as Abraham understood, and perhaps even better than Abraham understood, what her mission was in lifting the world up to a higher level. That is why when she got into the Pharaoh, the presence of Pharaoh, Pharaoh was not able to touch her. He was struck with a plague, and he was struck with illnesses, and everyone around him was struck with illness, because she lifted where she was. She lifted up the world to a higher plane of existence, where that level of spiritual impurity that Pharaoh represents, and all of his palace and all of his courtiers and so on represented, were not able to come close to that holiness that Sarah represented. So therefore, Abraham, understanding this, said, when we go down to Egypt, the general work of bringing godliness down into the world, which is the initial focus of a person's divine service, has to change in order to be able to elevate the world to a higher place altogether, so that when we come back out of Egypt, we will bring with us great wealth. What was the point of the great wealth that Abraham wanted to bring? He didn't need the riches. Right, fair amount of brick wall, that's correct, yeah. It's not that he needed the riches. What Abraham's intention was to bring what was in the realm of Egypt, the wealth that was in the realm of Egypt, into the land of Israel. In other words, into a state of greater holiness. That was the intention here. That was his intention. And therefore he says, when he says, say that you are my sister, in other words, we're together involved in this work of bringing, of bringing up what's normally part of Egypt into the realm of what becomes the Holy Land. And that's in fact exactly what happened. After this whole incident, Pharaoh gives him great wealth in terms of sheep and donkeys and this and that and the other, whatever, and he takes it with him to the land of Israel. And all those things, he offered sacrifices and so on in order to actually fix the the sparks of holiness that were embedded therein to fix it into a higher plane of reality. And that's actually what was going on. So when the Zohar talks about about Abraham and Sarah being the soul and the body, it became a manifestation of what will in fact happen in the future. In the future, it says that Eshet Chayil Ateret Ba'ala, a woman of valor is her husband's crown. In other words, the things that the body is able to achieve in this world and the holiness that it's able to achieve is something that eventually will be shown to be on a higher level even than that which the soul on its own can achieve. And that's the Zohar is sort of hinting to that idea being manifested even in the time of Abraham, what will be in the future in the Messianic era, in fact, in the era of the seventh millennium, as it's called. Okay, let's leave it at that. Are there any questions? I see that there were some questions before. So in relation to the ego. I have to think about that. I'm not quite sure what you mean over there, but if you want to write to me about it, maybe we could discuss it that way. The forces of Pharaoh were not necessarily able to read or understand the intentions of Abraham. They sort of fell into line automatically, even if they were not aware of what was going on, but they were sort of forced by force of circumstances, by force of the power of Abraham's soul, which was probably not, they probably weren't fully aware of it. Maybe they weren't even partially aware of it. So it kind of forced them into a situation where they had to agree to, and that's in fact the way it is. When the negativity agrees with the positivity and takes its lead from it, that's in fact the situation in the Messianic era. So this is within our mission of being in this world. This ties in, yes. Part of our mission in the world is not simply to make the soul dominant over the body, but to bring out, this is the whole concept of mitzvot, of actually physical commandment, fulfilling the physical commandments, to bring out that which the body can do that even the soul cannot do on its own. The soul can meditate, the soul can have intentions, the soul can do what's called yichudim, but the soul cannot on its own elevate the physical world, which is in fact the whole purpose of our being here. That's part of why we have a soul in a body, in order to elevate the physical world. Part of our mission in the world is not to make the soul, but to elevate the body, right? The focus must change. Yeah. Now, this is not necessarily something that always has to be the case. In other words, always that the body is teaching the soul what to do, so to speak. It doesn't always have to be the case. In fact, obviously, the normal situation is that the soul dominates the body, but the advantage of the body is that we have to start looking at it not as something to be despised and not as something to be simply indulged, but that the body itself is something holy. I don't think that you find this outside of Kabbalah, really, that the body itself is something holy. Generally, in mysticism, the body is regarded as something to sort of be dominated and to be subjected to the light of the soul. Kabbalah does see that the body has its own sanctity to it, and the way to elevate it is in Kabbalistic reasoning, the way to elevate the body is through the physical fulfillment of the commandments as part of our divine service. In other words, we don't leave the body out of the picture at all. It's very fine to go on a tour of Nirvana, so to speak, to as the expression in Hebrew is the Tayel B'Pardes, to take a tour of the Garden of Eden, right? It's a very, very, very wonderful thing, very nice thing. But the point is not to take a tour in the Garden of Eden, but to make the physical world in which we live a proper receptacle for the light of the Garden of Eden. That's what we're essentially doing. It's called in the terminology, in Hasidic terminology, it's called Lasos Lo Yizborach Dir B'Tachtonim, to make a dwelling place for godliness in the physical world. Make the physical world into a holy vessel for godliness. It does tie into being a light to the nations, in the sense that I think the nations of the world have not grasped this idea of the possible sanctity and the transcendent sanctity of the physical body, that the body can be just as holy as the soul, that Sarah can be just as holy, the sister, rather than the wife, the sister of Abraham, in other words, on a par. And in fact, to the contrary, she's the Eshet Chayil, she's the woman of valor who's the crown of her husband. She transcends her husband eventually. And that is in fact the way it is. And we see we see that, for instance, in the story of the spies, one of the commentaries, the Kli Yakar, very famous commentary, explains that that if Moses had sent women as the spies and not men, not the 12 spies, only 2 of them said we can conquer the land. 10 of them said no, we want to remain in the desert. The reason they wanted to remain in the desert was because they were living in the lap of luxury, in the lap of spiritual luxury. They were fed manna from heaven. They didn't have to do anything. They were sitting and studying divinity all day. That's all they ever had to do. And they knew that when they go into the land, they're going to have to plow, and they're going to have to sow, and they're going to have to reap. And it's work. It's hard work. And it's, cultivating the land and so on and so forth, and everything that goes along with that. Therefore, they wanted to stay in the desert. Had Moses sent women instead, they would have brought back the proper report of the land, and they would have gone right into the land and sanctified it right away. That's what the Kli Yakar says. So, okay, let's leave it at that, and hopefully we will have a class again next week. I don't see why not. I think things are on the up and up. I'm not 100% there, but I would say like, around 95 or so. So, getting there. See you all next week. All the best. Thank you. Yeah, 95% is good. Yeah. Could be better, but it will be hopefully by next week. All righty. Night, everybody. Thank you. Shabbat shalom, Ken. All right. Good night.